The employment rate of fresh graduates in Japan has reached 97.3%. According to data released by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Science, and the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare of Japan, as of April 1, 2023, the employment rate of fresh graduates in Japan has reached 97.3%. Although this data has not yet reached the peak of 98% in 2018 and 2020, it has increased by 1.5% year-on-year, the first increase in 3 years. At the same time, in a survey conducted by the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare of Japan, the average monthly salary of full-time workers in Japan reached a historic high of 311,800 yen, approximately 15,300 yuan, in 2022. Japan's CPI data, Consumer Price Index, excluding fresh food, followed closely, with a year-on-year increase of 4.2% in January 2023, the highest record in Japan since September 1981. In July 2023, its CPI increased by 3.1% year-on-year, surpassing the Bank of Japan's 2% target for 16 consecutive months. The rise in CPI is a good thing for Japan, which has been in a deflationary state for a long time since the 1990s. On August 15 of this year, the Japanese government announced an annualized GDP growth rate of 6% for the second quarter, April-June, which is more than double the previous economist's forecast of 2.9% and far exceeds expectations. Although in early September, Japan revised its annualized GDP growth rate for the second quarter to 4.8%. But this has also exceeded the annualized growth rate of 2.7% in the first quarter. Judging from these figures, Japan seems to be about to get rid of the deflation and depression that persisted after the bursting of the economic foam. In the 2023 Economic and Fiscal White Paper released by the Japanese Cabinet Office, the following statement also appeared. Wages and price levels are beginning to rise. These changes indicate that the Japanese economy is entering a turning point to get rid of deflation. Among all the economic data that drive GDP in Japan, its import and export data is the most prominent. Exports grew at a month-on-month rate of 3.2%, the largest increase in 2 years, while imports fell by 4.3% month-on-month. According to data, Japan's private consumption in the second quarter of 2023 decreased by 0.5% month-on-month, and on September 8, the decline of 0.5% was revised to a decline of 0.6%. The Japanese government's correction of the annualized GDP growth rate in the second quarter from 6% to 4.8% is also a good example. This correction is mainly due to a 1% decline in business spending, which the government had previously expected to be consistent with the first quarter. The slowdown in domestic spending and the rise in exports are also influenced by another important middleman, exchange rate. With the continued strength of the US dollar, the depreciating yen will push up the prices of imported food and energy, while enhancing the global competitiveness of export enterprises and the willingness of foreign tourists to travel to Japan. The car export volume leading the rise in export data is thanks to the depreciation of the Japanese yen. However, the growth of Japan's automotive industry still cannot match the boosting effect of the tourism industry on export data, although the tourism industry cannot be considered a true export. According to data from the Japan Tourism Administration, after the complete lifting of border restrictions in May this year, the number of inbound tourists in Japan hovered around 2 million, returning to the level of about 70% in 2019. This data is still improving, and by August 2023, inbound tourists have returned to the level of approximately 85% in the same period of 2019. The Japanese government and central bank still have to adhere to loose monetary and fiscal policies, even though European and American central banks have turned to tightening policies in the current situation. Although the average wage in Japan continues to rise in nominal terms, the increase is still insufficient. Economists generally believe that in order to meet the expectations of supporting a 2% inflation rate, the nominal wage increase of the Japanese people needs to reach 3%. According to data from the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, Japan's nominal income increased by 2.3% year-on-year in June of this year, but this number slowed to 1.3% in July. It is obvious that after adjusting for inflation, the real wages of the Japanese people cannot keep up with the speed of price increases. According to the statistics of the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare as of September 2023, the per capita monthly real wage in Japan decreased by 2.5% year-on-year by July, and the downward trend has been ongoing for 16 months. In the context of continued geopolitical tensions, most companies are more willing to choose a localized operating model. Japanese companies are no exception. the door to the return of Japanese manufacturing has been opened. According to data from the Japan Construction Industry Federation, domestic construction orders in Japan increased by 8.4% year-on-year in the fiscal year 2022, a new high in 2 decades. Among them, the orders for the electrical and mechanical industry have increased by 2.5 times. This growth mainly relies on the return of some production capacity and investment from semiconductor companies such as Sony and Kyocera. The increase in orders also means the return of the supply chain, which means that positions and salaries may increase. The end of this chain can be imagined as pulling domestic demand. On August 31st, Kishida announced that he would raise the minimum hourly wage, which is expected to reach 1,500 yen per hour, approximately 75 yuan per hour. Faced with the central bank's warning about uncertain inflation prospects, on September 25th, Kishida announced relevant measures for new economic measures aimed at promoting sustainable wage growth and mitigating the impact of inflation. The specific economic measures to be officially formulated by Kishida in October are mainly divided into 5 parts, including salary increases, stimulating investment in key domestic areas such as semiconductors, tax reductions, and controlling the rise of gasoline, electricity, and gas prices. During his visit to the United States, Kishida made a special speech and signaled to overseas investors that Japan would establish an asset management zone to attract fund managers to invest in Japan. In the past few months, the continued weakness of the yen has fueled a wave of foreign investment in Japan, which has pushed up the Japanese stock market. In June 2023, the Nikkei index reached its peak in 33 years.